All right. So you'll see that, this is one of the huge issues that every single company always faces. Is, remember last time we were talking about the fact that if you're a functionary, you're a functionary, right? Your loyalty belongs to the department, to the function. Most of the time, functionaries are thought to be as sometimes second-class citizens, mainly because they never really understand what's going on with the company. They just like to tinker around in their own department. And a lot of times that's why you'll see that there's so many people who start working, especially, I understand a lot of you are in technology, but on the technical side of technology. Do understand that unless you turn out to be absolutely brilliant at it, you're just going to be seconded to a basement level bit, right? Where all you'll do is do something absolutely mind-bogglingly boring in life, right? Even more boring than accountants, right? So, and you have to realize that in order to, and this is exactly the problem. The conflicting perspective has always been that business managers, people who run things, oftentimes think of IT managers, and especially in IT managers, think the same of IT technicians, as people they have no idea what they're doing anyway. They are just like worker ants who I say, find 50 errors in the code. That's all they will do day in and day out, right? Or fix something, or tackle something that nobody else wants to tackle because they don't like to look forward. They don't like to understand what is beyond this, right? Why does this thing work? You're never the puzzle master. You're just a person who just cuts a piece of the puzzle. You really don't know what the picture is. You just know that, oh, that's the puzzle. All I need to do is come up with a pair of nifty scissors. Come on in. Nifty scissors, and I'm just going to parcel it out. And that oftentimes creates a problem. So they think of themselves as the IT managers, as technocrats, who are only interested in new features or technologies, right? And they have no idea how it makes business sense. On the other hand, come on in, the IT executives oftentimes think of the business executives as they're very short-sighted, right? That all these new technologies that are coming in, should we go for it? For example, right now the big bit is analytics. The question is, should every company therefore start investing in analytics? Should every company start building a new division? And remember last time we mentioned, in times of uncertainty and volatility, the first thing you need to do is do what? Contract or hire? Always contract, right? Because contracting gives you the flexibility. It's a hedge, right? If things go south, you can always try and get rid of them. The minute you hire someone, it becomes very, very, very difficult, right? So if you start looking at the fact that just because a new technology has come to play doesn't automatically mean you need to get that technology. Does that serve your business purpose? Anybody who jumps around, feverishly about any new thing that's come to town and say that, oh, we need to get it, is the one who's going to fall short of expectations and at the end of the day also fall short of performance, right? And this is a huge issue in just about every single bit. As we actually move forward today, I'll give you some cases. But have you ever heard of this term called Babel? This thing called it's called the Tower of Babel. Anybody ever heard of it? The Tower of Babel. Anybody ever heard of it? You have? You have? Monsieur? What's the Tower of Babel?
People got together to construct the tower, and then God came down and changed their languages so they could no longer.
Yes, but yeah, very, very nicely said. So the Tower of Babel was supposedly a mythical instance of people coming together to build a tower that would be so tall and so high that it would reach God, right? And God doesn't like to be reached, right? It's not good business practice, right? If somebody finds you, good heavens, you're gone, right? You never want anybody to reach you. So unreachability is one of the attributes of being God. If you can reach God, the whole thing is gone. So what happened was they started building this tower called the Tower of Babel. Till God said, interesting. I need to come up with a way to save myself. And what he did was, or what she did was, actually God is a she, not a he, for sure. I guarantee you that when you meet him or her, you'll see that it's a her, it's not a he. But nonetheless, what God did was created something called the difference in tongues, right? So gave people languages and cultures. So what happened was every single language and every single culture started bickering amongst each other. And suddenly it was the biggest project management in the world, and the project failed, right? And that's exactly what happened. Do you realize the essence behind this is, beyond the quips, is the very fact that you have different languages and different cultures and so on and so forth also separates you tremendously in terms of how you even think of what's going on. It saddens me to say, did you hear about all these sexual assaults in Cologne during what you call it, the New Year's Eve, right? And it is a country that basically gave asylum to these bloody arseholes, right? But think of it, right? But this is not only a story of culture. This is also a story of, I don't want to point a religion or anything like that, point towards a religion or anything like that. But this is also a story of something that fails just in its midst. Especially, I find it egregious actually that there could be certain groups that would say, in our religion, women are certain way, or in our religion, men are certain way, right? And shame on them. And frankly speaking, that oftentimes becomes the issue, which suddenly creates such a sharp divide. Because at the end of the day, you have a bunch of bloody buggers coming to a place looking for arms, right, when they have nothing, and then they end up biting the hand that feeds them, right? And that oftentimes becomes the case. Now you'll find the same thing that people bemoan about when they're talking about in companies. That, good heavens, why is it that I come to work at a company and nobody follows that culture, right? And oftentimes that culture itself is a pretext or oftentimes a preface to issues that are much deeper, right? And in order to understand the problem, right, you have to first step out of where you are, right, or where you belong. And you have to look at it much more on a rational standpoint, but also understand it from an equitable standpoint. Understand what's equitable in life, right? Very important. Regardless of what you take away from this course, from an MBA, understand that the whole of this world works off equanimity, right? There's a bit of equanimity that runs the show. You see the same thing, right? I remember the last time when the EMBAs visited India, it was the same time where there was this horrid rape of some girl in an Indian bus or something like that, right? And this is, again, it's a country where women are like second-class citizens. And that oftentimes becomes a big issue because suddenly you're having to deal with a culture that's going to step in someplace. And you have to realize every culture carries a baggage with it, right? And it's not for you to change yourself to fit that baggage. The beauty of equanimity is that if you are rational and if you're equitable, you don't have to bow down to another culture which is moronic, right? And, I told you I'm not going to be politically correct at all, but do realize not all cultures are the same. Some cultures, of course, higher cultures, right? And I'm not going to a Nazi-type chant of Untermenschen and Übermenschen, but do realize certain cultures have progressed over time, and we will talk about it a little bit today, and then certain cultures have regressed over time, right? And you have to understand that at the end of the day, progress is the denomination that we are all running towards. The very fact that you're taking time off in this cold weather to come sit here and pay to listen to me or to listen to anyone else, basically the expectation is that you're here to learn something, right? And that brings us to this very interesting bit. You have to start thinking of the larger puzzle. Where are we heading, right? If I don't know if any of you are interested in art or paintings, there used to be a very famous French painter called Paul Gauguin. And Gauguin has this sprawling piece called D'où venons-nous, qui sommes-nous, où allons-nous, right? Where have we come from, who are we, and where are we going? You know, by the time I finish this sentence, the present is past. Every second we are spending, right, we are also losing that second. The question is, what are we spending that second towards? Are we spending it for something that is meant to better ourselves, our societies, the world? Or are we basically just here because we realize we're not going to contribute anything, possibly regress back to some old primitive form, and therefore not worry, all right? And then when I look at groups like ISIS, or Boko Haram, or Al-Shabaab, and all of these, again, absolutely decrepit pieces of non-consequential bits that only cause harm to the world, you sometimes think that, at the end of the day, there is going to be a big difference between what is defined as progress and what is defined as regress. And it's not always the job, of anybody who's progressive to simply try and understand regressive. Sometimes regressive is regressive. It's not your job trying to figure out, oh my God, what is the reason they think like that? No, some people just think like that, and if they don't change themselves, you really can't help them. You'll see the same thing amongst yourselves and your own friends and so forth. Some people are simply fanatical in their own thought. And that's the time when you can only, the same group, you'll find that a lot of people in the world are highly literate, but very little educated, because they don't have the education. But they do have literacy because they've taken a bunch of courses and passed them. And by some degree, they think that, good heavens, I'm educated. No. Hardly so, right? You've got to differentiate. And that oftentimes becomes this part of being an impresario, right? Somebody who knows how everything fits into a larger sense of the puzzle. Somebody who understands a symphony more than just a flute, right? So, going forward. So we talked about a little bit of economics last time. We talked about fixed costs and variable costs and all that stuff. So, as you come on, guys, chaps, try not to be late next time, right? Okay. Cheers. All right. When we talked about fixed costs and variable costs last time. So, fixed costs, once again, are overages, or overheads that you have to bear with, regardless of whether you're using a resource or not. It doesn't matter if you're using a resource. You have to manage those, right? On the other hand, variable costs are costs that are only utilized when you use a resource, right? So once again, if I were to quickly ask you, in your life, in your own lives, what are some of the fixed costs and variable costs? Anyone? Tuition is a fixed cost or a variable cost? Why is tuition a variable cost?
You can choose.
It's
Choose how many courses.
exactly. It's a function of the number of credit hours you take, right? If you choose not to take any credit hours, you have zero costs, right? On the other hand, what are some of your fixed costs? Rent, all right, that's a fixed cost, regardless of whether you stay in your house or not. Yes, sir. Mortgage, similar, right? Mortgage, whether or not you inhabit the property, right? You still have to pay a mortgage, right? What else? Fixed costs.
Healthcare expenses. Healthcare.
Possibly, right after Obamacare, you have to pay an insurance premium, regardless of whether you want to or not, right? Or at least an insurance penalty, even if you decide not to pay an insurance premium, right? So these are two very important pieces. One is, of course, the fixed costs and variable costs. Now, total costs, therefore, would be, so if you were to calculate total costs, so total cost would be equal to fixed costs plus, how would you calculate it? Variable costs times the number of units, right? Right? So think of it, assume your fixed costs are food and shelter, right? Whether it's a mortgage or whether it's rent. Then your variable cost might be tuition, right? Then for every credit hour you take in tuition, your variable costs, so you have variable costs I and then units of K I, because there are many different variable costs, right? So what you're doing is you've got many different variable costs. So where I, right, where I is equal to 1 to n, right? You have multiple different variable costs. Now the variable cost might be the number of miles you drive, right? That's a variable cost. So if you drove 0 miles, your petrol cost might be 0. On the other hand, if you drove 500 miles, your petrol cost would be multiple of 500. And that's why you have this I. The basic I basically means that it depends on several different dimensions. It's got different dimensions. That's all it means, right? So don't get worried about the mathematical notation. All it basically means is it's got different dimensions, and as these dimensions change, you need to incorporate these dimensions into your calculations, right? Now, the other bit is something called economic inputs and outputs, right? Let me see if I can open a new bloody page. I don't know how to do that. All right, well, can I add?
Maybe try the plus sign by the slide 313.
Which one, miss?
No, no.
You're right. Thank you. Merci. Perfect.
Oh, yes.
Vous êtes parfait. Thank you. So, all right, so let's look at something called propensities, right? And I'm going to ask you for your input. So these are called propensities. So you've got 3 major propensities. Every one of us, every country, company, person are guided by 3 propensities regardless of where you are, right, or who you are. One is propensity to consume, propensity to save, and propensity to invest, right? So all of these together, so these propensities assume are I, right? So let's call it PI, right? P underscore I. The sum of all these propensity I's is equal to 1. Does that make sense? Which basically means your entire income, a country, a company, doesn't matter. Their propensities are going to equal to 1. Therefore, let's try it in terms of marking it in terms of percentages, right? Because then you know everything's going to be 100% and therefore 1. And that's also, remember last time we talked about the fact that every time you embark on something similar, try to always standardize things. Absolute numbers don't really mean much. So it's very important to standardize things, right? So let's look at, you've got a huge population from India. So say India, US. Do we have any other countries here? China. Any other countries? Any other countries? No? So let's try these, Ray, right? So tell me, among all of you, right, let's start with India first. What, on average, what percentage of a person's take-home income goes towards consuming things? What percentage does a individual, on average, spend on consuming things? And I don't want any of you chaps to talk. I want these guys because I don't know if they can speak actually. So you want to go fast?
I think it's 60%.
60%? What about you?
It's
50?
50.
50% only? All right.
70 to 75.
Good heavens, look at the variance there. 70, 75,
60.
60, 70.
About 40 to 50.
Bloody hell. 70? No? Anybody else? 70? All right. So let's keep it at 50%, 40 to 50% on consumption. So what goes into consumption? Now you mentioned 40 to 50%. What goes into consumption?
Food, shelter.
Okay. Shelter too. So including shelter. What goes into consumption?
Majorly on transportation.
All right. And why is transportation consumption?
Maybe anything that you'll utilize, like
Anything that you expense. That's a good answer, right? So anything that you utilize or expense, right? So what's one way to figure out if this is consumption or not? Is it's whether you can expense, right, that particular bit, right? And I'm not talking about expensing at a tax rate, but expensing it as an outflow rate, right? So you can expense things on a tax basis. You can expense things as an outflow basis. You're looking at an outflow basis expense, right? All right, very good. So let's keep it for the sake of it, right? 70%, which is 0.7. Now, what is it in the United States?
Yeah, 80.
80, right? That makes sense, yes. 80%. What about China? What about China? Anybody from China? You're from China, right? You from China? What's it in China? Miss you? 70%? Are you asking me or are you telling me? Why are you asking me? Tell me. I'm asking, you tell. If two people ask, nobody ever gets to tell. 70? Yes, it shouldn't come with a question mark, should come with an exclamation. Good. That's better. 70%. All right? Going back to India, percentage that you save. Let's go back to you.
About 20%.
Hmm?
20%.
20%? 20%? 20? How can you add 70 and 40? You do 60-40 and zero investment.
no investment.
Could very well be the case, A lot of poorer economies, and originally that used to be, now you call them emerging economies, but typically a lot of third world countries didn't have, and that's actually an interesting bit. So let's keep it at 25%, right? Just for the sake of it, right? What about the US? Savings?
0.
5%?
You get 5.
5%? And China? 10%? All right, so what's left? So investment in India, therefore, would be 5%, right? In the US, 15%. In the US, 15%. And in China, 20%? Seriously? All right, so what goes... Mhm.
It's likely, I think.
Less?
It's likely to be 20%.
Likely to be 20%. So what goes into investment? What's investment?
Cars, buying a house.
Is a car an investment? Ah, very interesting. Very good. I want you to tell me what you think, regardless of right answers or wrong, because nobody in the world today has still decided whether something is an investment or consumption. So, all right, you said even a car, buying a stock, all right, what else?
Wouldn't there be
Well, houses are sold to you as if they're an investment, but they continuously depreciate in value because of neighborhoods.
It's very interesting now that you mention houses. So let's start off, right? So let's start off with this big nebulous bit in terms of what exactly is an investment. Nobody even knows that, right? Of course, one investment could be a bond market or an equity market, right? That's an investment, right? Because you're investing in something that's assumed to provide you. So remember just the way when I asked you, how do you define consumption? Something that you can expense, right? As an outflow. How do you define investment?
Something that gives you cash inflow.
When
Not
you,
always.
When you expect like your financial assets will grow over time by pledging money for some time.
Not always. But see, you've got all these things that we know for certain. Sometimes we don't know for certain, right? Because do all investments give you a cash out inflow?
No,
Only if it pays you a dividend. Only then. Even then, the price of it might go down, right? So it may not give you a cash inflow. Something that will appreciate, maybe, maybe not. You expect it to, but can somebody guarantee it?
No, you
So
cannot.
what is the tenet that defines an investment? Yes.
When you postpone your consumption by expensing it now, you call it an investment.
Yeah, but what is the tenet that defines an investment?
it increases your economic value.
No, it might decrease your economic value because think of it. All right, let's let's not take one step further. But let's get back to this bit. What's an tenet for investment?
Putting money
The
in.
objective
I
of
say
spending
money.
the money.
No, you're not talking about objective. What defines an investment? Investment is always defined by.
You hope of benefits, but it's not guaranteed.
Nope. Look at. Let me see if you can fill it in. Li starts with an Li.
liability?
No.
Liver.
Liquidity.
Beautiful. The key piece in investment is liquidity. Whether it's up, down, sideways, you can sell it on at any point of time, right? It's liquidity. You can immediately turn it into liquidity. Basically means the ability to convert an asset into cash. So even if it's losing money, you can still sell it, right? So even your stocks right now might be losing. I'm losing so much. I'm losing way, way higher than 6 figures. But I can't even tell you. I'm like bleeding every day. But what can I say? It's like hemorrhaging. I'm not bleeding. It's internal bleeding. But I can still cash out if I want to. Here's the issue. Now, we mentioned housing as investment. So, tomorrow you decide, you know what? I think my house is, because every time people get to go to sleep, they say, my house has a high value. A high value and a commensurate price are two very different things. You can go to sleep with a big smile on your face that, my house is appreciating rapidly. Is the liquidity immediate for a house? No. There's no immediacy in the liquidation of a house. If you immediately decide that, I saw my house as, I don't know, $400,000 right now, will you get $400,000 the next second or the next day the market opens? No. The time between assuming the valuation and getting the price for it is extremely uncertain. Now, guess what? So here's how it happens, right? And this is pure microeconomics, demand and supply. So you decide, I think my house is $400,000, so I'm going to put it in the market, right? And you put that house in the market. Your neighbors also say, he or she thinks his or her house is priced at $400,000. Good time to sell. I'm going to put mine in the market too, right? Guess what you've suddenly done? You've suddenly created a supply that is more than demand. What happens when the supply of anything is more than demand? The thing you're saying with this stupid bloody Iran deal, and with 500,000 barrels being pumped into the global economy at this point of time when crude is at its bottom, suddenly dropped oil by 7% yesterday. 7% yesterday, right? Went from 29 to 27, right? But do understand that. The idea behind that is, every time you suddenly decide that, oh my God, I'm going to take care of this move in the market, you've suddenly killed yourself by listing your house, because you've suddenly added to the supply, even though the demand might not be enough. Where there are only one house in the market, think of it. If there are only one seller and two buyers will bid against, will automatically increase the price. What happens if there are two sellers and two buyers? They'll basically work themselves through, and one person will get one house, right? What happens if there are two buyers and three sellers? So two buyers, three sellers. So now the buyers start having more choices. It's 1:1.5, which basically means now they can negotiate, so that that third person who's selling might not be able to sell his or hers altogether, right? So this third person will get into a panic mode and say that, oh, you still like those houses. How about I offer it to you at a lower price? And guess what? The market starts moving down. India is heading tremendously. If there's a time to short Indian real estate, this is it. This is a wonderful time to short Indian real estate because, again, every time I go to China, now China is dodgy because China, the transparency is so low. You have no idea. And of course, in China, I don't know if all of you know this. So when your parents or you end up purchasing houses, you're purchasing houses at loads of money, sometimes $500,000, $1 million houses. I've got loads of friends who live on West Nanjing Road in Shanghai, and they do very well in their lives. And they spend 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 million purchasing flats on West Nanjing Road. Of course, the flat overlooks the Lamborghini showroom, but it still doesn't matter. When they purchase that flat or they purchase a house, do you think it's a deeded property? When you purchase a house here, is it a deeded property?
Yes, purchase a house, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
right? What about a flat?
No.
Of course it is. Flat is still a deed. It's just a part of the entire structure. And it's a deed that expires when? Does that deed expire? You own it forever. So the expiration of the deed to your house that you own is infinity, right? If it's paid off. What's the expiration of? Do you think it's the same in China? When your parents purchase a house or a flat, is it
100 years or something.
In China, was 75.
70 years or 75 years, right? 70 years. Either 70 or 75, which basically means you can pay whatever you want for that place. 75 years later, it's going back to the government.
Really?
Yep.
You can pay to renew it.
Hmm?
You can pay to renew
Which
it.
basically, there you go. The catch is, you can pay to it. Now, question is, who knows 75 years later which government is going to be in power? Maybe it's going to be state-owned all over again. Which basically means the government takes the right of eminent domain. We've heard the term eminent domain, right? Where government can take over land if they think it's in the public interest, right? In that case, every single inch in China is eminent domain. It doesn't matter how much you've paid now. 70 years later, if you have the privilege, you'll get a chance to renew it, or else it's gone. So you're paying 1.2, 1.3 million to live there for 70 years.
That's like, yeah, like a 50-year mortgage.
There you go. Now think of it. If you're now, here's the other thing, right? Especially in places like, and it sometimes surprises me. Well, there's a fantastic bit in The Economist about house prices in countries from. So last time I was in South Korea, I was in Brazil. Same issue with all these emerging economy countries. What's an average wage in China? We talked about it last time, like about 5,000 RMB per month. The Chinese currency is called renminbi, right? The people's money, or the yuan, right? So it's about 5,000, right? The average, the entry-level basic wage is about 5,000, right? A mid-level manager, right, or even entry-level executives will make about maybe 120, 150,000 yuan. Is that a decent bit?
How much money is that?
We'll talk about that in 1 second. But is that somewhat right?
Pretty much so.
Pretty much. So assume 150,000 yuan. So right now, China half floats and half pegs it. So this is called currency pegging, right? So it's called pegging. Pegging basically means it's like creating a peg, and so this is the central currency, and this is the pegged currency. So the pegged currency is the RMB, and the central currency is the US dollar, right? So pegging basically means it gets to move, but only at the same rate all the time, which is a brilliant move because it sells wonderfully to companies in the US who are outsourcing to China. Why? They know exactly what their expenses are going to be for the next 5 years. Somewhere going to be between 1:6, or 1:6.5, right? Because I remember even Li Keqiang Li, one of your ministers, Li Keqiang. How can I never? That's why I never learn Chinese, even though I go there so many times, because I can never speak it. Li Keqiang.
李克勤，
Keqiang Li?
李克勤，
All right, Keqiang, all right. I thought I said that. No, Keqiang. All right. Keqiang, right? Chiang, right? Hello, Keqiang, right? And right now he's the vice premier under Xi Jinping, right?
Yeah.
Right? So even Li Keqiang mentioned the fact that China will float its currency, but the floating is never ever going to move between our 1% band, which means a corporation that's outsourcing to China is thrilled by it. That's why they know exactly what their expenses are going to be for the next 5 years, right? But that's brilliant, isn't it? Well, brilliant only to a point where it suddenly keeps your currency a bit too strong. Is a strong currency good? Is it good to have strong currencies?
Not for exporting.
Standpoint.
Yes?
It depends on the standpoint of whether you're exporting or importing.
All right, but in general, if you're exporting, all countries want to export. Is it good to have a strong currency?
No.
No? No? What about you? The chap with the hat. What's your name?
No.
No, but what's your name?
John.
John? So John, no? No?
I'm gonna say
You're going to say yes just to be a naysayer, all right? All right? You have to be a hedge fund manager. All right, yeah?
I don't know. Yes means no, but I don't know.
But, all right. There?
No.
Why no?
Everybody is exports and imports always.
All right, but why no? What's the logic behind saying no? What's the logic behind saying no?
If the currency is too strong, then nobody comes.
All right, no, let her. Could you speak a bit louder, please?
Low currency would increase foreign investment, make foreign investors to more active.
But why? very nice. So basically, if the yuan were to be devalued, right, which is exactly what your government did, right, what happens is suddenly you can buy more in China with the same amount of US dollars. And that is exactly what China wants. Now, the minute they did it, what happened to the global market, including the Chinese market? The Chinese market is down by, the Chinese investment, Shanghai Stock Exchange is down by what? Over 22%, I think so, this year itself. In the first 3 weeks of this year, it's down by 22%. First, because, and I personally think that too, nobody in China likes to invest in the market because they think it's rigged. They think it's a bunch of corrupt people. It's the same thing, whether you're talking about India or Brazil, all the emerging economies. Everybody thinks it's a rigged market because there's very little transparency.
the U.S.'s economy?
No. In emerging economy, typically people love to put money under their mattresses, or sort of, not really mattresses, but even frankly speaking, China has never ever, China and its government has always been a very interesting story. The government loves prosperity because it keeps people quiet. The idea is keep everybody's belly full, nobody's going to revolt. If things happen, and China has seen loads and loads of revolts, right? Including the internal revolt that went with, who's the Dowager Queen? Puyi, right? The Qing dynasty, right? Puyi and Shu Shi, right? Shu Shi and Puyi, right? The very last emperor, because China still ran the whole empire, right? From the Qing dynasty, or that started China, right up to the Qing dynasty, that ended, right? And that's the time right after which the Japanese came and invaded China. But China, even during the Qing dynasty, if any of you have ever been to Xi'an, a Shaanxi province, you'll see the very famous terracotta warriors. Most of the time when you look at these terracotta warriors, they look like hundreds and hundreds of meters of terracotta warriors. Every warrior used to hold a sword or some kind of a weapon. When the revolt happened, the villagers stole the weapons to kill the people, right? So China is a fragile economy that holds each other, that holds the whole set by selling prosperity. Keep people prosperous, everybody's happy. One time, later on when we talk about a little bit more of politics, when we talk about how global thing, we'll talk about somebody called Bo Xilai, right? A very famous guy in China, right? And the story of Bo Xilai is a perfect story of how much China dreads the very fact that somebody could suddenly talk about equality. Bo Xilai was like a version of Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders. You don't know Bernie Sanders? What are you doing sitting here there? You don't listen to politics.
Bernie Sanders?
Bernie Sanders, you?
He's a Democratic candidate for president.
He's like a mad Democrat. I like him better when Larry David plays him, actually. That was fantastic. But Bernie Sanders. So you see the same thing in India, another very fragile economy where everything is held by religion there. Every single thing is unmanageably held. Because frankly speaking, whenever I've visited India, I always think this country should be like 4 different countries. Nobody likes anybody, and it's basically held in a very fragile manner. But it's very much like a country like Iraq, possibly, right? It's created, but it's not really a country. There's never been a sense of being a nation. It's just a country, right? There's no idea of a nation. Everybody thinks differently. Everybody's fighting about something else, right? But it's interesting. But you see the same thing if you go to Brazil. In Brazil, you'll see these magnificent houses just beside these favelas, right? And even Brazil has this huge issue. But again, Brazil, like India, held gingerly by religion. Everybody. They hate each other, but they love God. Believe me. There's a perfect example. The last time I remember, it was in 2009. I was in India. You see people dying on the road, but everybody prays like crazy. Like no idea of treating people like rubbish. But praying, everybody's like left, right, and center. There are like temples around every corner you can find. But everybody hates each other, right? But
Not always.
not always and not everybody, right? Just the majority, right? Like yeah, you know. Wouldn't you say? I'll tell you. So last time I visited, I got off in New Delhi, and then I, of course, forget the traffic. But once you get in, there were places where you're walking towards some very fancy malls with like expensive cars around you, and you see people like dying on the street and begging on the street, and people are dodging them as if they were to touch them, they'll get some affliction, and they're carrying their bags while paying no heed. Then I see people, we got invited to somebody's house, and they were talking about every different thing and how India is spiritual, and you should see the way they treat their servants. I was thinking, right, something's missing here. But anyway, again, if somebody can sell it culture, I sell it in terms of regression, right? But nonetheless, you see very similar bits. When you go to places like South Africa, when you go to places like Egypt, when you go to places like Lebanon, right, you see very similar bits play out. But one strength, so going back to this, right, one huge strength of an economy is understanding. Let's go back to this bit. In terms of understanding the culture of operations. And if it's a corrupt culture in general, the investment section is always treated to be dodgy. And I can guarantee you, if you ever look at what I just said, look at the correlation between the corruption index and the propensity to invest. You'll see the higher the corruption index, the lower the propensity to invest. Why? People realize people are corrupt in general. Same thing in India, right? There's so much corruption in the streets, even in China, although you can't see that corruption is felt, right? And this corruption is basically not like bold-faced corruption like you see in India, where like people are paying money to other people to get things done. I remember, again, going back to that same instance, when I got up in Delhi, somebody asked me if I would pay him $20, and this was an airport official. And he would take my luggage out without even going through customs. I was wondering, wait, what happens if somebody's carrying a bomb in their suitcase? Or something. Yes, well, that's one way to control population, right? That's a good population. I'm joking. But, sorry, that was terrible. But that was absolutely terrible. Do forgive me for it. But then I find how egregious it might be that somebody even loves, and this is an airport person, which means must be colluding with other people at the airport to get this thing done, right? And then that becomes suddenly a big piece. Therefore, what happens is, in these countries, people, if you don't even trust the equity market, where do you think you're going to invest? How many people even buy bonds? Even bonds are supposed to be dodgy because you really don't know what the government is going to do, and the government index typically is very dodgy. People suddenly misplace their idea of what an investment is, and they start doing what? Purchasing property. Suddenly they get away from that main tenet that investments have to be liquid to purchasing property, because that for them is the only viable option left. And guess what? You suddenly create a property boom, therefore a property bubble, and with tremendously inflationary pressure on property prices, where the property prices keep rising like crazy. And the minute property prices start rising like crazy, what happens? Contractors start building things. And suddenly, guess what? Your existing houses are suddenly being trumped by new places, right? More condos, more flats, right? And guess what? You're suddenly creating such a glut in the economy because it's suddenly inviting people with deeper and deeper and more indebted financing schemes. And the whole thing you're holding on to is, I hope the economy doesn't go a little bit south. Now, do understand, this is exactly what happened in Iceland. I visited Iceland in 2012. People even then were going back to the fact that, it's sometimes good to stay with our traditions and have they have this version of slightly fermented shark, like very much like Chinese shark fin soup, like in the Cantonese shark fin soup.
That shark that they put in the sand.
Yes, and
it's
then they'll
black.
let it. Yes, the skin will go black, and that's the time. Very much, by the way, that's exactly the way they used to treat venison. So even if you go into Midlands and Scottish Highlands, they still treat venison that way. They'll get venison and put it under the earth, and then let venison. They call it curing venison, right? And they typically will cure venison and it gets like slightly soft, and then they'll cook it. And that was their mechanism of reducing a hard meat with some degree of infestation, right? But no, maybe. Yeah, well, of course, some degree of bacterial infestation comes with it, right? But nonetheless, the Icelanders in 2005, between 2005 and 2008, Icelanders were buying houses like crazy. Everybody was driving, or not everybody, a lot of people were driving Range Rovers and so forth. Till, of course, they realized they live off something called a borrowed economy. It's not their economy, it's a borrowed economy. And that's what we're going to get at today, right? This borrowed economy is based on the fact that we don't really own anything that we produce, right? So let's get back. So in Iceland, these were financial banks. None of them were Icelandic financial banks. They were all financial banks from the UK, Germany, Belgium, US, setting up shop in Iceland. They were employing Icelanders, right? Now, they were producing products and services that were meant for the rest of the world. The Icelanders didn't own any of these products and services. So when the financial crisis hit, what happened was the bank said, too much fixed costs associated, we need to reduce our fixed costs. We need to pull away all our assets from Iceland. And guess what? The entire economy went bust, right? Same thing in Ireland. Places like Cork, places like Dublin, were so much dependent upon companies like Dell. When Dell went south, Cork suddenly had a 30% unemployment rate. You see it right now in places in Spain, places in Italy, places in Greece, right? 30% unemployment is quite common, especially among younger people. People have no idea where they're going to get a job. However, so going back to this, China, you've got a median income. Now, 150,000 RMB divided by 6 is how much? $25,000, right? So $25,000, right? And that's per month. No, that's per year, right? 150,000 is per year, right? Per year. So $25,000 per year, right? Fantastic. What's the average price of a decent size, suppose 1,500 square feet flat? Somewhat decent size flat in a decent neighborhood, in a general urban area. Well, by the way, if you don't mind me asking, where are you from? Which part?
Beijing.
Beijing.
But I'm also familiar with the situation in Shandong province and Hainan province.
Shandong and Hainan.
Yeah.
All right. Hainan.
The island.
Yes, Sanya.
Yes.
Yes, I've been to Sanya. Ah, cool. They've got a wonderful Sanreji out there, right? Yeah, I know Sanya. You're from Shanghai, right? So I know Shanghai very well. I go to Shanghai very, very often, quite often. And then if you look at both places, Beijing, let's just think of, so Sanya and Hainan are more like Hawaii, right? A version of Hawaii. Or more like Saint Martin, right? Where, the Dutch islands, where you go there mainly for recreation purpose, loads and loads of tourists, huge 100-feet yachts and so forth all over the place, right? But let's talk about Beijing, Shanghai. Either of these two cities, two very big cities, what's the average price of a flat out there?
How many bedrooms?
Suppose 2 bedrooms, a general basic flat. 2 bedrooms, 1,600 square feet, 160 square meters.
Okay. About 0.4 million.
1.4 million?
No, not 1.4.
0.4?
Lowest. Which rate are you talking about?
No, you average.
Average? Oh, that's going to be high. Like 0.8 million.
So $800,000.
Yeah.
So think of it. An average executive or an average manager earns $25,000 a year. And the average price of a house is or a place to live is $800,000. If you were earning $25,000, would you even be qualified to purchase an $800,000 house? No. What about Shanghai? Similar, you would say?
100 square meters, and the average should be 4 million.
Sorry, miss?
For
400,000?
4 million RMB.
4 million?
RMB.
4 million? But doesn't matter. Let's convert that into dollars.
Dollars.
So,
600.
so 650,000, right? About $650,000, right? So again, similar. They earn about $150,000 to $200,000 per year. RMB per year, right? An average, a decent salary is, would you say between 150 to 200,000 is a decent salary? So 200,000 would be 1.2 million RMB. Is that a good salary per year? It's a good salary per year. So 200,000 RMB is about 33,000 US dollars, right? About 33,000 US dollars. 33,000 US dollars price of the flat is 650,000 US dollars, right?
People in China don't buy their own house. Our parents pay.
There you go. That's exactly what I was getting to. So the question is, how do they fix it? And the only way to fix it, this is how I learned it. When the first time I went to my friend's house on Nanjing Road,
How much?
this,
How much?
I didn't know how much the house cost, but what I found, I know that it was very expensive. But when I went there, it's like a 1,400 square feet apartment, where his parents live with him too. And believe me, yes, I can't even think of living in a house with my parents, even if it were like 5,000 square feet. But it's amazing that in 1,400 square feet, the parents have just one small room and they're taking care of the child. But what they're doing is they're paying out of their pension fund to pay for the set. Now, in India, if you read that, I'll try and give you guys that Economist article. And by the way, if you get a chance, read The Economist. It is possibly the best publication in the whole world. It's called The Economist, right? There's nothing that even comes close to it, right? So even in India, the question is, so if I may ask, where are you chaps from? Where are you from? You're from Hyderabad. Bangalore.
Kanpur, UP.
Uttar Pradesh, right? So that's South India, right? A lot of it is that South India, right? So what's an average decent salary there? Average salary. Average middle manager salary, right?
50,000, 55,000. per
USD.
month.
No, 50,000 US dollars per year.
10,000 US dollars per year.
What are you saying then?
10,000 US dollars per year.
10,000 US dollars. So 10,000, what's the Indian currency rate right now? It's about 60? 60? 66, right? 65, 60. So, so 10,000 times 65 is 650,000, right? 650,000 rupees per year. Is that a decent salary?
50,000 rupee per month.
50, that's less than $1,000, right?
Yes.
And now, which is, all right, so fair enough, that makes sense too, because China's GDP per capita is about 3 times that of India, right? That makes much more sense. So the average, now, so 650,000 rupees, right? How much is the cost of a very similar 150, 160 square meter apartment in India?
It would greatly vary. In my
Average.
in my city, it would be 25 to 30 lakhs.
And that is how much? 30 lakhs is 50,000? $50,000. Oh, that's not bad. And then, how about in your areas? Similar?
Similar to that.
So 50,000 to 100,000.
100,000.
So it's interesting. Now, if you are now let's see. These are the interesting bits. This is typically how, if you ever end up getting into, and I would say, now let's talk like 2 minutes about your careers, right? A great career, especially if you're doing your MBAs, but a great career is get into consulting for very large firms. Doesn't matter what area you come from. If you're in architecture, companies like IBM Global Services, companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, companies like Deloitte, companies like McKinsey, like Bain and Company, they will hire you regardless of what your original expertise is, because they have all industries that they serve. So companies like McKinsey or IBM end up serving huge architectural firms around the world, and they need architects who are very good at understanding that bit, because then they'll manage very large projects for them, right? But these are very large consulting firms. Great place, but that's where you learn this art of mixing things and making decisions by combining multiple pieces of puzzles together, right? Now, if you were to look at it, now of course, and the salaries are very good right now. My friend was mentioning the starting at Accenture, IBM is about 75 for an MBA, and for McKinsey and Bain is about 90, right? So the starting salaries are, and these are all entry level. So your typical progress is you get in as an entry level analyst, and then you stay as an analyst for 4 or 5 years, after which you become a consultant, and then you become a mid-level consultant, a senior consultant, then a project lead, right? And you stay as the project lead for a few years, after which you start becoming they start considering you for a partnership. Very much like an architecture firm, right? Because the architecture firms typically follow the same bit, very much like a law firm, right? So they call them principals, so you can start becoming a principal. You say same idea, but I would say look at these, and they're fantastic opportunities. Use your expertise, but say that I can do something more. And that's why I presume you're getting that dual degree too, right? Because that gives you a very good sense. So whether you're in finance, whether you're in economics, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in fashion, that doesn't matter, but go and start thinking a little bit different, right? So let's look at it. So you said a typical salary in China would be about, a good salary in China is about 33K, right? And housing is about, let's keep it as 660K, right? Let's keep it average, right? So this is basically 1:20, right? In India, this is average salary, you said was?
10,000.
1,000 a month,
Yeah.
right? A 1,000 a month would be about 12,000 per year, right? And a house would be, or a flat would be, how much?
260, 50.
So 100,000. Let's keep it 100,000, right? 65 then.
50.
Let's keep it 100,000 just for this.
96.
96. All right. Let's keep it 96k, right? Therefore, the ratio is how much?
1:8.
1 is to 8, right?
So it's 3 times.
Now think of it. That suddenly tells you a very interesting comparison. Now this is how you start making comparisons, right? Whenever you're comparing, what you're doing is you're trying to get everything apples to apples, oranges to oranges, right? Otherwise, it's very difficult comparing anything, which basically tells you that there is, right? So if you were to look at what is 8 by 20, how much is 8 by 20?
40%.
40%, right? Right? So there's suddenly 40% that's missing, right, in that entire calculation. On the other hand, what's happening is, if you look at what's left is 20 minus 8 is 12, right? Right? 12 by, when you're looking at this particular difference, you're also realizing that difference between the cost of housing is going to steal some part of this, or this, right? Has to, right? Where are you going to tackle the missing piece of the puzzle? So something has to grow, maybe by 1.5 times, right? Maybe by 1.5 times, where you have to suddenly take away that particular bit to make sense. Now, you'll see that, so this is the propensities. How do governments, now, can the government control propensities? That's the next question. Can government control propensities? Yes? Maybe? How?
Subsidizing.
All right, not a good answer. Good attempt, and I love these attempts. Always come up with good attempts. Doesn't always have to be the best answer, but it always comes up, gives you a sense that you're thinking. What else?
Controlling the interest rates for banks and bonds.
Brilliant. Controlling the interest rates. So the government's job is never to create subsidies. A government that starts creating subsidies, you heard. Why did the Shanghai market drop yesterday again? You know what the government did yesterday morning? The government injected $91 billion into the investment side by basically buying stocks up to buoy the market. Everybody can see through it, which basically Chinese public or the Chinese investors said, maybe things are really bad. Why is the government trying to help out the market? Same thing when China tried to devalue the yuan. This is what started it. When China started devaluing the yuan, everybody said, the government is trying to devalue the currency. Must be because China isn't selling enough. Things must be really bad. Sell. Government's buying up assets. Things must be even worse. Sell. Think of it. That's why, China, the Chinese government created a 7% trigger. A 7% trigger in the market was, if the market dropped by 7%, the trigger would automatically set in and all investment, all trading would stop. Right? Right? All trading would stop. It's like a circuit breaker. The minute they put that circuit breaker in, people started selling like crazy. You know why? Everybody said, if we miss that time, trading is going to stop. So sell as much as you can. So things started dropping even deeper. And it's interesting because, this version, so just to finish off, what we talk about, and then when, by the way, we'll be meeting not next week, not Tuesday after that, because I'll be returning Tuesday. And we'll be meeting the Thursday after that, right? Bless you. So here's a very interesting bit, and I'll just tell you a quick bit. The government's an odd entity. Every time governments try to engineer something, they always turn out to be absolute failures, right? And a perfect example is in China. Anybody of you ever watch a brilliant HBO series called Vice? Have you ever heard of Vice? Maybe I'll show it to you one of these days. It's a wonderful 10-minute piece on, China during Mao Zedong's time, right? During Chairman Mao's time, tried to social engineer China because China has been extremely superstitious, right? Just like India, extremely superstitious, very religious, extremely religious, right? And so the idea was getting religion out of China and superstition out of China, making people more rational, right? And in that part of rationality, they said that, people generally are stupid, all people in the world, and that is true. Most of the time, you have 5% people who think, and the 95% people who follow, all over the world. It doesn't matter which country it is. And 95% who follow. If you ever go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is an absolute brilliant edifice, and I'm a huge reader of Jefferson and Thomas Paine, there's a wonderful thing that it says on there. It says that the worst thing that can ever happen to a country is for ignorant people to become free. And this is very true. What happens when ignorant people become free? They have no idea what freedom means. If you've never been able to think, but you're given a chance to vote, what do you vote for? Donald Trump, I think, is the smartest guy in that whole bloody group. He at least says things that everybody thinks about, but nobody's ever mentioned. Nobody, it's interesting. No, people will vote for people like Bernie Sanders because he is a populist. He knows that if I can tell everybody, you know what, I'll take every college degree is going to be free. Guess what? Your college degree is going to be worth nothing the day every college degree is free. In a place where everything is perfect, perfect becomes average. Do you realize that, right? Perfect doesn't remain perfect anymore. If everybody gets a college degree, you'll have to think of, all right, where do I fit into this puzzle?
It's kind of like that now. I mean, a master's isn't
But think of it.
valuable as it was.
That's exactly what has happened. And that's the thing. I personally always think that college should be like way more bloody expensive. Because that's why people who go to college are going there because it is something that you really want to do. Not just one mechanism. So going back to China, just to finish off. China played around with this idea of one-child policy. When they created one-child policy, especially in rural areas, people started realizing that if I were to have a daughter, I can't use daughter as a labor. Plus, of course, in all third world countries, women are never thought to be a sense of power. Of course, in India, they pray to women, but they treat women like terribly, right? They rape women on one side and they pray to women on the other side, right? But the idea was daughters are not going to be valuable additions to society, so people started aborting. Whenever they found they were having the likelihood, especially in rural areas, they started aborting daughters. Now the entire demographic shifted so much. There are places in Beijing and Shanghai where there are Friday and Saturday park meetings. You know of these, right? Where guys will come in with their resumes, or guys' parents will come in with their resumes, because now there are fewer women and way more men. Now you've got a great auction set up, right? You could choose. Oh, no, not you. And when I show it to you, you'll laugh, but deeper is the very fact that anytime you try to engineer anything, it typically ends up blowing up in your face, right? Thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful 1.5 weeks, and I shall stay warm. Well, you'll stay warm. The weather's weird anyway. But I'll see you 1.5 weeks later, Thursday, right? Thursday. All right? Thank you very much. Moving forward, you have to realize that IT can no longer be viewed as a tool to support back-office transactions. Everything that you're seeing you can't think of a single industry, from finance to marketing to analytics to basic retail, every single, to basic even restaurants and bars, everything nowadays is being marked by using technology. The question is, you have to know when to use the technology and when not to use the technology. So you're seeing these emerging economies prop up. The countries that are typically called BRICS, BRICS, right? So BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and S is South Africa. Now, Brazil itself, if you think of each of these countries, Brazil itself is floating in oil, but the problem is that it mainly has oil. Beyond that, all it does is it serves some other countries. Russia too, same issue as Brazil. It suddenly found loads and loads of oil in Kazakhstan, but after that it's got to figure out how to actually take care of its consumer level support system, which it's missing altogether. India basically provides back-end services operations for tech companies. It doesn't own any of the forward technologies, so it's building something for Microsoft on a platform designed by Microsoft or by Apple and building things for different companies. But none of its own companies are there to ever make a claim to anything that it's doing. China, very similar. It's the main manufacturing support system, but again, even the conveyor belts that a Chinese manufacturing company uses is a conveyor belt that's made by some Western company or a Japanese company. So it's very important for them to get out of that mode of thinking. And of course, South Africa tries to sort of move itself as, in a way, to provide the entire continent of Africa with its goods and services. But that itself is not an easy feat to accomplish, because the whole of Africa oftentimes is so riddled by so many issues, except for small countries or large countries, but small in number, countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, South Africa, and of course the North African countries used to be one of South Africa's huge outsourcing partners and global partners, and now they're in a bit of a problem. So these countries are also using various levels of technology or basic resources, but they're still being controlled by technology, because suddenly technology is changing the way things are happening. And the way it's doing it is by using changes in physical and time barriers. Today, this is what we call as chasing the sun. Chasing the sun basically means that it really does not matter where you are in the world. You can actually keep your factories running 24 hours a day. So when the work stops in the US, work begins in China. So when it's 8 p.m. in the US, it's 8 a.m. in China. People are just coming in to work. So even though you're not having to pay workers overtime, night shifts, and so forth, you can keep your factories running, because now you're operating 24 hours a day. And of course, there's a lot of pressure now on IT executives. They have to manage change and they have to lead strategy. No longer do they have to worry about the technical bits of things, but the question is, how do we actually create change, manage change, and lead your strategy? So the new things that are happening in the markets are as follows. So firstly, markets are being defined by new technologies. You have RFIDs, you've got trading that's happening in nanoseconds. This is also called HFT, or high frequency trading. You've got CRM, which is customer relationship management. You've got different financial controls exerted by IT systems, which are trying to figure out if there's a sudden movement in a stock, there's sudden movement in a market, when to close in, when to close out, auditing systems to see if things are in compliance. enterprise resource planning systems, that's ERP. It's basically a mechanism to link all information within an enterprise together so that you can see everything as a snapshot without having to worry about every single functional place one after the other. And then, of course, cloud and ubiquitous computing, software as a service. The cloud basically means the internet. So all you're saying is we don't have to have things by us on our local machines or on our client machines to run something. We can run it off a remote terminal somewhere, just the way we use Google or we use your apps. As long as you have a network connection, the world is your oyster. Perfect example is Wikipedia. If you look at Wikipedia, you're not no longer linked to a library, but you're linked to an online library, and that's a cloud setup, right? So as these things are happening, the traditional business models are being changed. You see, newspapers are disappearing. Nowadays, most of us get our news through an online medium. Even sometimes these newspapers are trying to make an online presence, but they still have a lot of fixed costs to operate. So understand this very well. The fixed cost for newspapers is very, very, very high. They still have to run all these machines, produce all these papers, but you never know if they'll sell or not. That's why you'll see that Amazon, on one hand, has all its warehouses, all these loading facilities, and then AWS stands for Amazon Web Services, right? Amazon Web Services. And that is making much more money to an extent that it's supposed to be spun off in a few years, if not this year itself. So things such as contribution margin, which is revenues minus your variable costs. Gross margin, which is revenue minus costs of goods sold, and PE, which is price to equity, which basically tells you to what extent are you earning for every bit of equity that you have. And, your price to equity is a very interesting mechanism because you'll see PE is typically marked as greater than equal to 17 is a general market valuation, which means that a company's stock price is oftentimes marked at 17 times its earnings per share, right? So, which is a very interesting bit. But it also tells you that these companies, therefore, have a lot of speculative pressure, that they're likely to do very well, where you start valuing them 17 times more than their earnings. And of course, there are companies that are hundreds and hundreds of times more than their earnings valued at those. And, but this is dependent on what you think the company holds in the future rather than what it's offering it to you today, right? And as you look at these things, and this is an example of a typical automatic trading setup where you set a buy order through E-Trade or TD Ameritrade or Schwab, and it's going through a bunch of different banking institutions that are possibly, writing those offers and fulfilling those offers. And there are all these mechanisms where you look at liquidity, where you've got all these different exchanges, different clearing houses through which orders are fulfilled. But this is all done in milliseconds or often nanoseconds because of technology. So, when you understand global markets, it's important to understand the changing demographics and psychographics. And this is an important thing to understand. Why is it that KFC succeeded in China, but Home Depot failed out there? And a lot is to do with the demographics and the psychographics. Psychographics basically means how people feel. Demographics are basic facts about people, their race, their income, their gender, their education, and so on and so forth. KFC realized that the Chinese market is an interesting market. It offers typically fried chicken, but they didn't want to offer fried chicken and French fries, which are very popular somewhere else. Instead, they put fried chicken with something like congee or a Chinese, a, a basic Chinese noodle soup, so that people would be interested in trying out their own cuisine, but also get a chance to try out the fried chicken that KFC offers. And KFC succeeded tremendously. On the other hand, if you look at Home Depot is a very famous store, very famous because it sells stuff that is wonderful for builders and especially for a country where a housing market is in its boom. People would love to buy things from Home Depot because it's all about building materials and build it yourself. But the build it yourself bit is what was problematic. People in China, now that they're becoming white collar, feel it would be beneath them to ever go and shop for building materials or build things themselves, because that is presumed to be lower than what they are expected to do now that they're white collar. So Home Depot was in the right market, but focusing on the wrong set of consumers. So it's very important to understand both demographics and psychographics. And then, of course, as different parts of the world start getting more and more contracts from different companies, they start building things, they start paying their workers more and more. And as workers get more skills, they start to move from one company to another, asking for more and more wages. This creates something called an inflationary pressure. And the total cost of labor keeps increasing. And we've already talked about the propensities to consume, save, and invest. And that becomes an important bit of the puzzle, because as people start earning more money, their propensities to consume, to save, and invest, they change dramatically. Let's keep it hit. Let's chat to here and then carry on the next time we meet together. Cheers, guys.